Hi, Russ of AquariumX here. Are blue death-feigning beetles the best pet invertebrates? Well, today, after a brief introduction to the species, we'll talk about housing and care, and then look at the pros and cons of keeping blue death-feigning beetles so that you can come to your own conclusion. Blue death-feigning beetles are superbly adapted for life in the desert. In fact, their name reflects that. The blue part of the name, which comes from this pale coloration that they have, which looks blue in some lights, is from a waxy secretion that is thought to protect the beetles from the fierce rays of the desert sun. The death-feigning part of the name comes from the fact that when disturbed by a potential predator, the beetles will often remain immobile for long periods of time, and that's thought to help protect the beetles from predators that detect their prey mainly by movement. The tough armored exoskeleton of these beetles is so efficient at protecting them from water loss that they can go a long time without food or water. But we'll talk more about food and water when we go into care. Now let's talk about housing. Blue death-feigning beetles are not too demanding when it comes to an enclosure. You could use a plastic bin. You could use a small vivarium like this one. I'll put a link in the description to this particular vivarium. Or you could use a much larger one. This is a 20-gallon long vivarium here. Lighting, other than ambient lighting, is optional. For this vivarium, I use a 6500K 23-watt compact fluorescent bulb. And for this larger vivarium, I'm using a 50-watt reptile basking bulb. Now, these are not necessary, and if you do use a basking bulb, you need to be careful not to overheat the beetles, and so I have one side of the vivarium that's warm and the other one that is the cool side. But as I mentioned, lighting is optional. They will get along just fine if there's ambient lighting in the room. On a related note, blue death-feigning beetles thrive at room temperatures. If you're comfortable, they probably will be too. The low to mid 70s are great, but honestly, they come from deserts where it gets pretty cold and pretty hot, so anywhere that's remotely room temperature is probably fine for them. For substrate, I like to use play sand. That's the main substrate that I have in this vivarium here. Although on the right side, because I am breeding the beetles, I've got a different type of substrate there, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. If you're just keeping the beetles, just a couple of inches of play sand is fine, and you want to keep that dry, especially on the surface, because the beetles prefer low humidity. You'll know when the humidity is appropriately low when the beetles are this light blue color. If they darken up, it means the humidity is too high. When the beetles are shipped, for example, they might come a little dark just like these did, but after a few days they should lighten up. If they don't, the humidity is too high. And on the topic of low humidity, let's go into ventilation and the cover that you'll use for the enclosure. Now, if there's nothing that you need to protect the beetles from, they can't climb the smooth glass surface of an aquarium or vivarium, so you don't necessarily need a lid, but in many cases you'll want to protect them from inquisitive hands of children or other pets, things like that, and so a lid is a good idea, but it needs to be very well ventilated, so a screen lid is optimal. I have had screen lids on these two enclosures that I use. As far as decor is concerned, a lot of pieces of wood. I use some sagebrush wood in here, some cholla cactus wood, as well as some flat rocks. The wood and rock surfaces provide a lot of areas where the beetles can climb around and things like that, as well as provide hides. During the day, they like to hide under these pieces of wood and things like that. You have a lot of options when it comes to decor for your beetles. Just about any reptile-safe decoration can be used, and some people have even put sun-bleached bones that they found in the desert, and as long as they sanitize them first, that can work too. As far as care goes, blue death-feigning beetles, perhaps not surprisingly considering their adaptations to the desert, are pretty easy to take care of. Feeding blue death-feigning beetles is pretty straightforward. In the wild, they tend to eat a lot of dried insects, and so part of their diet should consist of high-protein items. A lot of people use dry dog food, dry cat food, fish food pellets, or fish food flakes, and I've used some of those myself. You can also provide dried river shrimp, sold for use as fish or turtle food. I'll put a link in the description to some of the ones that I use, and the beetles will eat those. and they're pretty similar to the dried insects they'd find in the wild. You can also use beetle jelly. I have a card here that will direct you to a video that I made about making your own beetle jelly, or in the description I'll have a link to the Bugs in Cyberspace page where you can buy beetle jelly, and both of those will work as one of the food items that you can provide. The beetle jelly will also function as a source of hydration for the beetles. And on the topic of hydration, you can also provide water for your beetles by providing them with juicy vegetables. Sliced organic carrots are popular as a food item for the beetles. The beetles will eat them and they're readily available. I also use organic sweet potato slices. You can use cucumber slices and various other things. I do recommend that whatever vegetable slices you use are organic, or at least rinsed very well and peeled, to avoid giving insecticides to your beetles. And giving them those juicy vegetables will provide all the water that they need. You can mist a corner of the enclosure occasionally, but you want to keep the enclosure overall quite dry, as if you provide too high of a humidity in the enclosure, it can be bad for the beetles. So that's about it for care and feeding of the blue death-feigning beetles. As you can see, it's quite easy. So let's move on to the pros and cons of keeping these beetles. Well, one of the pros is pretty obvious. They are very low maintenance, easy to care for, something that you can leave for at least a week on vacation and not worry about at all. So that's definitely something that makes them attractive as a pet. Another great advantage of these beetles is that they are very easy to handle. They're not going to bite. They're not going to exude foul-smelling substances onto your hands, anything like that. And they're pretty resilient. So even a small child, as long as you can trust the child to be careful, is not going to harm one of these beetles. You don't want to handle them excessively because you can rub too much of their blue coating off. But even if you do, it will return after a few days. Another great thing about keeping these beetles as pets is their activity. That's one of the great attractions of these beetles. They're pretty active at certain times of the day. They tend to be most active in the morning and the evening. They're crepuscular, most active at dawn and dusk, but they are active potentially at any other time of the day or night, and they're really fun to watch. So I would recommend, if you're going to keep them, that you keep them in a place where you can see them in the afternoon and evening, where you're likely to see more of their antics. But the interactions they have with each other, the way they clamber over things, the way they eat, it's all pretty entertaining to watch. Another great thing about these beetles is that they are communal. Not only can you keep a group of death-feigning beetles together, and you can keep them in pretty large groups, you can keep them with other species of desert beetles. They get along fine without any problems. I've kept them with maybe 3 or 4 different species of desert beetles without any problems at all. Not only that, you can keep them with velvet ants. And as long as you make sure that the enclosure is escape-proof, because velvet ants can climb smooth surfaces such as glass to some extent, they can make great enclosure mates. And I learned about this from Bugs in Cyberspace. And if you haven't checked out his videos on this topic, I recommend you do that, and I'll put a link to those as well. Another fantastic aspect of keeping blue death-feigning beetles is that they are very, very long-lived. There's an anecdotal report of one living 17 years, and I'm sure that there are many other beetles that have lived for many, many years. So it's not one of the invertebrate pets that you're going to lose in a year or two as long as you're taking good care of it. You never know what age you're going to get them at, but you'll probably have your blue death-feigning beetles for quite a while. Another advantage to keeping blue death-feigning beetles is that we're just beginning to crack the code on captive breeding them. Now, the larvae are easy to produce, but to get them to pupate and turn into an adult beetle is a little bit more difficult, but the information is out there and it's starting to happen, which I think is fantastic. So now let's talk about the cons of keeping blue death-feigning beetles. As with any pet, there are some disadvantages. So one of those is that there is limited availability of these beetles. They are collected seasonally, and they're getting fairly popular in the trade. So you may not always be able to find them, or if you can, you may not be able to find them for in the numbers you want or at the price you want. They can be somewhat expensive. You can expect to pay between 10 and 20 US dollars the time I make this video for one blue death-feigning beetle. Another disadvantage is that these beetles are not widely bred in captivity yet, although I'm hoping that will change. As a matter of practicality, it's much easier to collect them than it is to breed them because the larvae require very specific conditions in which to pupate. And because of the time and the expense associated with that, there's probably not going to be a lot of mass production of these beetles in captivity. However, I'm hoping that more and more hobbyists will be producing them, just like I'm working on. If you want to know more about my Blue Death-Feigning Beetle breeding project, you can check out my playlist. I'll put a card to the playlist up here so that you can check that out. So the fact that Blue Death-Feigning Beetles are not really widely bred in captivity leads to a couple of other related disadvantages. One is that you never know how old a Blue Death-Feigning Beetle is when you obtain it, and so it may possibly be near the end of its lifespan. Another fairly minor disadvantage, but some that some people find significant, is that when you get a Blue Death-Feigning Beetle, it's not uncommon for a wild beetle to be missing part of one of its legs or a foot or something. Beetles usually get along just fine without it, but aesthetically it may not be the most pleasing thing, and captive bred beetles will probably be less likely to have issues like that. I think the most important factor in the fact that these beetles are not widely bred in captivity is just the sustainability of collecting them. They are very common where they're from, but you know, there's a limit to collecting everything, and we don't want to over collect the beetles. And so hopefully, like I mentioned, more hobbyists will be breeding them and at least contributing to a captive bred population of these beetles, despite the fact that it's probably never going to happen on a grand scale. So, to sum up, Blue Death-Feigning Beetles are a lot of fun to watch. They're very easy to take care of. They have extremely long lifespan. They're handleable, but they're not really widely bred in captivity yet. But that could change. Let's hope so. And now, before I share with you my Blue Death-Feigning Beetle breeding project, I'd like to take a moment to thank my Patreon supporters. And here they are. I really can't do it without you. You help so many of my projects, and if you want to support me on Patreon, check out the link at the end of this video. Okay, and now on to my beetle breeding project. When you're breeding the beetles, it is important, of course, to have males and females. The easiest way to tell a male from the female is to look at the antennae. Unfortunately, with my camera, I can't get a shot that is clear enough at such a small resolution to make it work so that you can see it. But the antennae of the males and females differ in that the males have much hairier antennae. They've got bristles coming out of the bottom of the antennae, and the females lack most of those bristles. So this is my breeding enclosure, which you've seen before, but I wanted to go into a little bit more about the substrate. In addition to the sand substrate that I talked about before, on this side of the enclosure I have added organic compost and leaf litter, as well as alder pellets that have been soaked until they resemble wet sawdust. And I mixed them all together, and I mixed those into the substrate on this approximately third of the vivarium, and that provides food for the larval beetles. I also dampen this side twice a week. I don't want it to be too wet, but as you can see, the beetles are retaining the appropriate color, so the humidity in the enclosure is appropriately low, even if I dampen this, but it does keep the substrate at a higher humidity, higher moisture level, which is appropriate for the larvae. If you don't maintain an area where the substrate is a little wet, or damp at least, then the larvae can dry out very easily. I have gone through and collected 8 larvae. I'm leaving some larvae in with the adults intentionally because I want to see if I can successfully get the larvae to reach a mature size at which they will pupate inside the container with the beetles. But I also wanted to ensure the survival of some larvae, so I've prepared these containers. The larvae can be cannibalistic, especially of smaller specimens, and so I've separated these out. Let's take a look at some of these. Here's one of the enclosures. I've got a shallow layer of sand in here, as well as the other substrates I mentioned, the organic compost and the alder chips that have been soaked, and the leaf litter. I've added a little bit higher proportion of leaf litter to this now that the beetle larvae are in here. I'm going to put the beetle larvae back in here. I took it out just for filming purposes. Something funny that I've noticed is that the larvae seem to feign death too. They'll get quite immobile for a minute after you handle them, and then they'll start moving around again. So as you can see, this one's approximately 1 inch long, and so it's about halfway to the size at which they ideally pupate. They can pupate at smaller sizes, but then you get smaller beetles. And so I'm going to grow these out until they're about 2 inches long, or slightly under that, and then I need to incubate them. I learned from Dean Ryder on a thread on arachnoboards that you need to keep them at about 88 degrees Fahrenheit for ideal pupation temperature. They need a humidity of about 75% relative humidity, and they need to be kept separate from other larvae. So in addition to the possible cannibalism that can occur by keeping the larvae together, they inhibit each other from pupating. And so here are just a few of the larvae. You can see I've got 2 that are approximately the same size and then one smaller one. They look a lot like mealworms. They are related, both from the tenebrionid group of beetles. But one funny thing about these is they have paler heads than mealworms do. They're a little bit pudgier and have kind of a translucent quality to them. And in addition to playing dead, a funny thing that they'll often do, if I'm holding them for any length of time, I can feel them nibbling on me. It doesn't hurt, but I can definitely feel it. So at this point, the next step is just to wait for these beetles to grow till they're approximately 2 inches long, and then I need to put them in an incubator. So my Patreon supporters are helping me get that incubator. If you'd like to contribute to the Blue Death-Feigning Beetle breeding project, you're welcome to do so. And thanks for watching today. Please feel free to watch the rest of the playlist on best pet invertebrates. You can leave a comment, a like, share the video with someone who you think might like it, and if you haven't already, subscribe. And then click the bell icon so you don't miss my next video.